Lord, and that we would be filled with your Spirit. All eyes on Jesus. In your name we pray. Amen. So, our message today is in our series of last day events. Is that okay for everybody? Is that too far this way? Okay. And it's on the millennium. But it's not just about the millennium. We're going to talk about some other subjects that surround the millennium. It's interesting as I was studying this out and preparing this message and working on this, that it came to mind that there were several issues at play that distort, pervert, or otherwise confuse our understanding of what the millennium is and what purpose it serves. And so the effort today is to go through and us to discuss these things and to show these things for what they are from a biblical, cohesive perspective. Interestingly enough, our church feels strongly enough about the topic of the 1,000 years that it's one of our 28 fundamental beliefs. In fact, it's belief number 27, which says, the millennium is the 1,000-year reign of Christ with his saints in heaven between the first and second resurrections. During this time, the wicked dead will be judged, the earth will be utterly desolate, without living human inhabitants, but occupied by Satan and his angels. At its close, Christ with his saints and the holy city will descend from heaven to earth. The unrighteous dead will then be resurrected, and with Satan and his angels will surround the city. But fire from God will consume them and cleanse the earth, and the universe will thus be freed of sin and sinners forever. So as I was studying out this topic, I realized that there were three primary understandings of the millennium. The first is amillennialism, the second is postmillennialism, and the third is biblical millennialism. Now, out of those three, there are further offshoots. There are various deviations of each of the others where the understanding and the placement of events and things varies slightly. But in an effort not to spend 8 hours giving a dissertation on the millennium, I've tried to condense it down to the general ideas that exist today, the general understandings that exist today, and share our understanding and share a understanding that exists on the world field, if you will. So first we have amillennialism. Amillennialism is a position that was popularized by Augustine around 413 AD, and it places the millennium between the death of Christ and his second coming. During this time, Satan is bound in the sense that he cannot prevent the preaching of the gospel to all nations. So, amillennialism, if we were to look at it on a linear perspective, it occurs on earth, the millennium occurs on earth, and the first resurrection is when Jesus is resurrected. So we have Christ's resurrection as the beginning, and the second resurrection that's mentioned in Revelation 20 occurs at the second coming. So it holds that the second coming is the second resurrection. I probably spelled that wrong. You have to forgive me. So this period in between is what is understood to be the millennium. Now, one of the problems with this is that obviously from the time of Christ's resurrection to his second coming has already been more than 1,000 years, right? So part of the amillennialism view is that this is a symbolic time period. Okay? And part of the reason why they say that this is a symbolic time period is because because Revelation is viewed in its entirety as being symbolic. There is no literal meaning behind Revelation. It's viewed as all symbolic, and if it's all viewed as symbolic, then the millennium, this 1,000-year period, must also be viewed as symbolic. So the next thing is Satan is bound from preventing the spread of the gospel. Now, that's interesting because one of the things that it said is that this is a time of God's special blessing on the flourishing of the gospel, is what this period is supposed to be, is a time of flourishing of the gospel, because during this time, Satan is bound. Now, he's not bound from tempting people, but he's bound from preventing the spread of the gospel. So the gospel is able to go forth more freely and without any speed bumps, so to speak. But we understand the biblical perspective behind the sharing of the gospel doesn't include removing Satan from the picture, right? The gospel will go forward based on the work that we do in conjunction with the leading and the guiding of the Holy Spirit, right? The gospel will go forward in spite of Satan's work to stop it. So this view presents that Satan is bound and it allows us to go forward. It allows the gospel to go forward without any roadblocks, so to speak. It's interesting if we look at this that we see that this time that was supposed to be God's special blessing and Satan bound, we actually would have characterized as the Dark Ages now. We see that as a time when God's word was suppressed from the people and kept from the people, and people lived in darkness as to what God's word said. So that's amillennialism. Postmillennialism came from Daniel Whitby, a 17th century writer who popularized this understanding of the millennium that stated that the first resurrection would be a great outpouring of the Holy Spirit, the national establishment of the Jews, the overthrow of the Pope and the Turks, and that these events would mark the beginning of the millennium when the gospel would go forth with convincing power. Under the ministration of the Holy Spirit, the church, with converted Jews and Gentiles, would march across the world and bring great light to the nations. During this time, Satan would be bound, and the victories of the gospel would lend credence to the promise of Christ to be with his disciples to the end of the world. Christ's second advent would take place only at the end of this glorious earthly millennialism. And after this golden age, the end would come and Christ would return to judge all and raise the dead. So postmillennialism looks a little bit different. We have Christ's resurrection, but it's marked by the outpouring of the Holy Spirit is when it's to begin. The fall of the Pope, which we understand to have occurred in 1798, with General Berthier entering into France and taking the Pope captive, and the Pope later dying. So we have the fall of the church there. Excuse me, I got to go back a second. And then the fall of the Ottoman Empire, or the decline of the Ottoman Empire. And for you history buffs that are out there, the Ottoman Empire began to decline in the 1600s before its ultimate fall after World War I in 1922. But it was in decline before that. It had lost much of its land and its holdings and had been reduced in size and power considerably by that time. So we have these events that are supposed to occur, and then the last one was the establishment of a Jewish nation state. So we have a nation state for the Jewish empire, or I shouldn't say empire, for the Jewish people. Those events would usher in the millennium. There would be a millennium that would occur post these things. And that millennium would last, and then we would have the second coming. Now, the problem with postmillennialism is that as time has gone on and these events have occurred, there's been continued violence, multiple wars, world wars, and a base inhumanity. In other words, the vision of postmillennialism, that the Holy Spirit would be poured out and that Satan would be bound and the gospel would go forward with great power, hasn't come to light. This has caused postmillennialism, the idea of it, to fade over time to where it's not viewed it's not viewed under the same light that it once was, as being a correct interpretation. Also, with postmillennialism, we see that this period of time occurs on earth again as well, where we have Satan bound once again during this period, but all of this is occurring on earth. That stands in contrast to what we see in Revelation chapter 20. As we read about that millennium period, we realize that there's some circumstances, and we'll get more into this as we go along, but we realize that there are some circumstances that have taken place on earth to make the earth to become what? Uninhabitable, right? And so the idea that these things would occur on earth stand in contrast to what the biblical narrative tells us about the millennium. Now, the third view is biblical premillennialism. And this is the view that we as Adventists in our 27th fundamental belief aspire to. It says this name refers to premillennialists who believe that the millennium will follow the second coming. However, the millennial kingdom will be in heaven, while on earth all is desolation. So why the confusion? Why do we have these different views of the millennium? And I'm going to draw a line that's going to stay up here. This is the millennium. This is biblical premillennialism. Millennium occurs in heaven. This is the biblical premillennial view. And I'll go ahead and put the second coming in here so that we have that one in place and ready to go. So why the confusion? Well, as I was going through this and studying, I realized that there were three primary topics that had subtopics that have become attached to them that lead to additional confusion over what the millennium is. They dilute or pervert the meaning of and the purpose of the millennium. So those three areas that we're going to examine are the second coming and the idea of a rapture and a secret rapture. Because there's two divisions of the idea of a rapture. There is a rapture of the church, and then there is a secret rapture. Both of them have met mainstream popularity among Christians today. The second area is the judgment, the understanding of what the judgment is. As we look at what the judgment is, we will see that man has always tried to do what with judgment? Avoid it. We don't like judgment. Judgment's not a good thing, right? But for the Christian, it takes on a different connotation. And then the third area that we're going to look at is prophecy and a 7-year tribulation. A 7-year tribulation is another idea or theory that has gained in popularity over the last 20 years. It has really gained traction within Christian circles, and it's beginning to take hold in churches. So we're going to look at these three areas specifically as we try to understand how some of this confusion has occurred and where it fits what God's linear idea is for his kingdom and for his people. So the four texts are on the screen up there for you to be able to reference. There's several texts that we're going to bounce around and go back and forth between, so I went ahead and put them on slides so that you would have them in advance and make it easier to flip back and forth. You could look in advance. So the first topic that we're going to discuss and talk about is the second coming and the idea of a rapture. The first two verses deal specifically with the second coming, and I want us to identify a couple of important points about what the second coming is. So if you want to go ahead and turn to Matthew 24, verse 30 through 31. Open up to Matthew 24, verses 30 and 31. Interestingly enough, a few weeks ago, we studied over this same verse whenever we went through Matthew 24. So verses 30 and 31 tell us, "Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and then all the tribes on the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of glory, or coming on the clouds of heaven with power and" what? Great glory. Okay, so first of all, the second coming is marked by Jesus returning with power and great glory, right? Okay? Now look what it says next in verse 31. And he will send who? His angels with what? A great sound of a trumpet. Now, so there's a trumpet involved, and Jesus' angels are involved, right? Now, let me ask you a question. Have any of you ever heard a quiet trumpet? If you have, I would like to know where you got it from, because I need a quiet trombone. Where's my son at? There he is. Yeah. There's something about brass instruments and quiet. They don't go together, right? They don't fit. There's no such thing as a quiet brass instrument. So as we're reading this, we see here that Jesus sends his angels with not just the sound of a trumpet, but what kind of sound? A great sound of a trumpet. And they'll gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Okay? So we have this trumpet and Jesus' angels, Jesus descending with power and great glory. Now let's go to the next verse, which is 1 Corinthians 15, verses 51 and 52. And let's look again at what the circumstances that are shared here around the second coming. 1 Corinthians 15, verses 51 and 52 says, "Behold, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the what? At the last trumpet. For the trumpet will do what? And at the sound of that trumpet, what's going to happen? The dead will be raised incorruptible, and what's going to happen to the living? We shall be changed." Okay? So in addition to this, we have the resurrection of the dead in Christ. So we have the resurrection of the dead in Christ, and we have the changing of God's people, where we put off our mortal selves and we take on what? Immortality. Amen. Exactly. Okay? And we also have a trumpet again, right? Trumpet times 2. Boom. So the trumpet is clearly involved in the second coming. Now, let's look at some verses that are used commonly for a rapture or the idea of a secret rapture. We turn to 1 Thessalonians 4:17. 1 Thessalonians 4:17 is interesting Because most oftentimes we just this is the only verse. This is the verse that's taken, and it says, "Then we who are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and thus we shall always be with the Lord." So we have the people of God being what? Being taken up, right? And we've covered that already with the resurrection of the dead in Christ and the putting on immortality and being called up. But the problem is, when you take this verse out of context and you don't read the surrounding verses to lay a foundation for what this says, it creates the idea that, oh, well, that looks like a rapture. Now, the word rapture isn't bad in and of itself. Rapture can mean to be caught up. Okay, if you look up the definition for rapture, you'll just the standard Merriam-Webster dictionary or wherever you look it up, you'll see that the understanding of rapture is to be caught up, and most of the time it's in reference to the second Christians being caught up with Jesus in the air. But if we back up a little bit and we read verses 13 through 18, suddenly this idea of a rapture takes on a completely different meaning. Verse 13, starting in 13, it says, "But I do not want you to be ignorant, brethren, concerning those who have fallen asleep, lest you sorrow as others who have no hope." Now, Paul was dealing specifically with an issue with the Thessalonians. They thought that when a person died, that was it. If they didn't live to the second coming, when Jesus came back, that there was no hope. They had this misunderstanding. And so Paul's writing to them to clear up this misunderstanding. And so he tells them, I don't want you to be concerned for those who have fallen asleep, lest you sorrow. For if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so God will bring with him those who sleep in Jesus. So Paul's simply saying, look, the people who died are going to go with Jesus as well as those that are living, the righteous living. And he goes on to say, for this we say to you by the word of the Lord, we who are alive and remain until the coming of the Lord will be by no means precede those who are asleep. Now, we already saw that the righteous dead will rise first and be what? Caught up to the Lord, and those who are alive will follow after, right? So Paul is now reconfirming that here. And it says in verse 16, "For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout." So now we have a shout that's been added, okay? And I love the shout. Because how did Jesus speak things into existence? He spoke. I should have said, how did Jesus bring things into existence? He spoke. I said that backwards. He spoke them into existence. And this is a joyous occasion for Jesus. And he doesn't just speak, but he shouts the righteous dead back into existence. And then we have the trumpet again, with the trumpet of God. And the dead in Christ will rise first. And then we see verse 17, then we who are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and thus we shall be with the Lord. Therefore comfort one another with these words. It's very hard whenever you take this in context to understand an idea of a rapture or a secret rapture that would create additional confusion in other aspects that we're going to talk about here in a few minutes. Now, one more verse that we're going to look at is back over in Matthew, and this is the other verse that is commonly referred to whenever we talk about a rapture. 24 verses 40 through 42. "Then 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken and the other left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and the other left. Watch therefore, for you do not know what hour your Lord is coming." Now, on its face, again, just these verses singled out appear that what's happening? A secret rapture. People are disappearing, right? It's as if I would be standing here and then, just instantly I'm gone and the rest, some of you guys are gone too, and the rest of you are sitting around like, where'd he go? What happened? But whenever we take this in context, and we look at the context of what we're talking about, we get a different perspective. If we back up a little bit, we see Jesus says in verse 37, he says, "But as the days of Noah were, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days before the flood, they were eating, drinking, marrying, and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark, and did not know until the flood came and took them all away, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. So Jesus is describing that in spite of the strife and the craziness that will be going on during this time, there's still day-to-day activities that have to happen. People will still be living. Right? Even in the aftermath of massive disasters such as Hurricane Katrina or other hurricanes that have hit, or volcanoes that erupt and obliterate areas, life still goes on, right? People still have to continue to eat, live, go places, and do things. And so what Jesus is saying here is that the Son of Man, the second coming is going to come so quickly that people aren't going to realize what's happened. That it's going to happen in such a way, life is going to be continuing on, that it will seem to people that it's just happened. It's happened quickly. As we see in the previous verses in chapter 24, which we just talked about, Jesus had just described to us what his coming was going to look like, right? So why would Jesus describe his coming to us earlier in the chapter and then change what that coming is going to look like or how it's going to function later on in the chapter? Does that make sense? It doesn't make sense. So the idea of a secret rapture has become mainstream in recent years due to popular books and movies that have been released. The timeline of events created by a selective or secret rapture and life continuing on earth for a period of time dilutes the significance of the millennium period and its purpose. Next, we're going to talk about judgment. And there's 4 verses for judgment. If you would like to, you can go ahead and get ahead of those and have them bookmark. Interesting thing about judgment. Mankind has been trying to escape God's judgment since the fall of man. You believe that? What did Adam and Eve do after they sinned? They went and hid themselves. Why did they hide themselves? Because they knew something was wrong, didn't they? And when we look, this is what I found fascinating as I was putting this together and doing this study. I was impressed with Genesis 3:9 through 10 and Revelation 14 verse 17, and how they can parallel one another in what God is appealing to us for. So Genesis 3 verses 9 and 10 says, "Then the Lord called to Adam and said to him," what? "Where are you?" Now, does that sound like judgment? No, not really. That sounds like concern, right? That sounds like divine intervention to bring his people back to him, right? Verse 10 goes on to say, "So he said, I heard your voice," this is Adam, "I heard your voice in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked and I hid myself." So we see this, we get this first glimpse right off the bat that mankind has been trying to escape God's judgment from the beginning. But God's judgment, the way he comes to man, is to say, "Where are you?" He wants us to return to him, not to have to judge us. He wants us to return to him. And this is seen in chapter 14 of Revelation, verse 7, where it says, "Saying with a loud voice, fear God, give glory to him, for the hour of his" what? "His judgment has come." But what does it say? "And" what? "Worship him who made heaven and earth, the sea, and springs of water." See, ultimately, it's not judgment that God wants to have to pronounce upon his people. It's what? He wants to gather us back for worship. He wants us back to him. Where are we? That's the question. Now, dealing specifically with judgment, we can turn to Daniel chapter 7, and this is something that we've been going through in our midweek series. if you would like to do a deeper dive and understand this a little more than kind of the surface skimming over that we're doing right now, I would invite you to go and watch our Wednesday night services. Verse 10 says, "A fiery stream issued from and came forth from before him. 1,000 thousands ministered to him. 10,000s times 10,000 stood before him." The what? The court was seated and the books were opened. So this is the image of judgment that Daniel is given as he's being given these visions of world history and what's going to transpire. And he sees that there's judgment that's going to occur. Daniel chapter 7, verse 22, perhaps for some of you, just a page over, Daniel is concerned about this vision, and he's wanting to know more. Specifically, he wants to know more about this fourth beast. But as he's wanting to know more about this fourth beast, he's talking to the angel, and he's recounting what he's been shown, and he restates what he has seen in the vision in just a slightly different way, but it is in complete agreement. In verse 22, he says, "Until the Ancient of Days came, and a judgment was made in favor of" who? "The saints of the Most High, and the time came for a saints to possess" what? "The kingdom." So, judgment is in favor of who? Favor of the saints. And who's going to possess the kingdom? The saints. So my question to you is, as Christians, as those that have faith in Jesus and His saving power and the work that He's done on our behalf, do you fear judgment? Shouldn't. The people of God have nothing to fear of judgment. If we understand judgment from a biblical context and from the way that God has presented it to us, He is always trying to what? Draw us back to Him first. He's not quick to kick us to the curb, to judge us and do away with us. He is long-suffering. That long-suffering is for the benefit of all of us. It is to draw all men to Him. Misapplication of the millennium is just another way to prolong or put off or pervert the nature of God's executive judgment. Men whose hearts haven't been changed don't want to look at judgment because it's a convicting truth in the heart. It requires a response. If you don't want to make a response to God's plea, your idea is to push it off as far as I can. Let me make it of no effect if I possibly can. In amillennialism and postmillennialism, both of these things occur on earth. Both of those, that 1,000-year period occurs on earth, and it presents Satan being bound as a condition of the success of the gospel going forward. But the success of the gospel message is dependent on the cooperative work of who? The saints, God's people, us, right? Everyone who professes Jesus, and who? The Holy Spirit. The work of the Holy Spirit in that person's life. That's what propels the gospel forward. It's not the binding of Satan in some arbitrary manner so that he can't mingle in the Christian lives and the things that are going on in churches. That's not going to slow the gospel down. If God's people are moving forward in faith and on fire for God, will anything stop the gospel going forward? So I ask you today, are you ready to move forward in faith, on fire for Jesus? Next is the prophecy, is confusion existing around prophecy. And this confusion around prophecy brings us to an idea of a 7-year tribulation. I invite you to turn to Daniel chapter 9, verse 27. Most often, this is the verse that trips people up. I'm going to go ahead and erase this because I'm going to need some room for the this prophecy side real quick. This is the verse that trips us up most frequently whenever we're looking at this. Remember, we've already kind of established how judgment is something that we want to kick to the curb. We want to push it as far away from us as possible because we don't like the idea of God's executive judgment. But the saints, those who fear God and who love Him and who keep His commandments, don't have anything to fear from judgment. So it's the same with prophecy. Those that fear God, that love Him and that keep His commandments, that want Him as a part of their lives, we have nothing to fear from prophecy. We have no reason to misunderstand it or misapply it or change it. Verse 24 says, verse 27, 9 verse 27, "Then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he shall bring it in to sacrifice and offering, and on the wing of abominations shall be one who makes desolate, even until the consummation which is determined is poured out on the desolate." Now this verse is a part of a larger prophecy, right? It's a part of what prophecy? The 70 weeks, okay? So this is a part of the 70 weeks. We understand this. Now, my question, and this isn't a trick, but what is the 70 weeks a part of? The 2,300 days. Exactly. The 2,300 days. So this is a part of the 2,300 days. If we back up and we look at verse 20, If we back up and look at verse 23. Let's go to 23. Verse 23. Daniel is praying and confessing his sins and the sins of the people, and it says, "At the beginning of your supplications, the command went out, and I have come to tell you, for you are greatly beloved. Therefore, consider the matter and understand the vision." So the angel that's talking to Daniel is referring him back to the vision that he was concerned about, that he's been thinking about and has been on his mind, which is the vision of the 2,300 days. Now, this was on Daniel's mind because Daniel understood Jeremiah to say that that God's people, the Israelites, the Jewish people, would what? They were going to be released from bondage and go back and rebuild the temple and usher in Jesus, usher in the Messiah, right? Daniel understood this, but he sees this vision of the 2,300 days and he understands what it means, but it seems like it's way farther off than what he understood from reading Jeremiah. And so he's concerned about that, and that's one of the things that brings him to this prayer and supplication time. And so the angel comes to him in verse 24, and he says, 70 weeks are determined for your people and for your holy city to finish transgression, make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, bring in everlasting righteousness, seal up the vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. So the angel is separating out this 70 weeks, okay, for the Jewish people. He's helping Daniel understand that no, all of that 2,300, that wasn't at the end of that. That's not when all of this is going to happen. There's a period that's carved out for my people right here. This has to happen. And so it's that 70 weeks. Now what happens is, as a result of that 70 weeks, we know that 70 weeks is broken into 3 periods, right? So we have our 70 weeks. One week, 7 weeks, and 62 weeks, right? Everybody with me? So this is 69 weeks total, and this is 1 week. It would help if I could spell correctly. Okay, so as we look at this, we see in verse 25, the angel tells Daniel, "Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and rebuild and build Jerusalem until the Messiah, the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks." Okay, so here's our first period. 7 weeks. Commandment to restore and rebuild. Anybody know what year that happened? 457 BC. Okay? So we have 457 BC. For 49 years, this is what went on. To restore and build Jerusalem until the Messiah, the Prince. Okay, so, I'm sorry. Let me back up. Know therefore and understand that the going forth of the commandment to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the Messiah, the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again and the wall, even in troublesome times. So this first period was to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. Okay? This second 62-week period was to make an end of sins, make reconciliation for iniquity, what we see in verse 24. Okay? And then it says in verse 26, and after the 62 weeks, the Messiah shall be what? Cut off. This is where the trouble begins, because verse 27 talks about the Messiah, right? So we have this idea that the Messiah, I'm going to grab a different color here for a second, that the Messiah has been cut off. And what people take that to mean is that prophecy, that week, has been moved. That week doesn't apply there anymore. Okay? And what happens is this is called unreckoned time in prophecy. Okay? So we have to do something with this. So what do we do with it? Well, it turns into an amalgamation of this 7-year period and the tribulation that's talked about in Daniel chapter 12, verse 1. So if you go to Daniel chapter 12 and verse 1, you see there's a moment here that says, at that time Michael shall stand up, the great prince who stands watch over the sons of your people, and there shall be a what? A time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation. So this time of trouble and this idea of that week are combined to become a 7-year tribulation. Now, if you look out in the books and the movies and the TV shows and all of the things that are being put out today for people to consume, it focuses on this idea of a 7-year tribulation where Satan will be unleashed and the beast power of revelation will be unleashed and will be allowed to go after God's people. But what happens is, in the timeline of things, there is a rapture that occurs, and then you have your 7-year tribulation before a second coming again. And this moves that 7-year prophecy down to the end and creates confusion within God's Word. Now, the idea here is that the prophetic clock stopped because of the Jewish rejection of Jesus. So this moving this is all about the Jewish people having a extra period of time to reconcile Jesus to themselves. It's all about those who weren't raptured. The church gets raptured. It's about those that don't get raptured having a second chance, if you will, before the second coming of Jesus to be saved. But as a result of having that second chance, they have to go through this 7-year terrible period where the beast power is going to be after people and all of these terrible things are going to be happening. This is confusion that is finding its way into the church because of what's out there in mainstream media, in books and things that are being written that aren't biblical. But they're becoming more than they were ever meant to be. People are being misled by these things. So the tribulation is this missing week of prophecy. They're joined together to be a 7-year tribulation. So now, I have a question for you. It talks about during this 7-year period that people would have an opportunity to turn back to God. That's one of the ideas behind it. Now, God's people may suffer at the hands of men, But ultimately, those men will be the ones who suffer at the hand of God. Jesus told us that we were to expect what? Expect trouble, expect persecution. But it comes with a promise in Matthew 24, verse 9. Matthew 24, verse 9 tells us, "Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, and you will be hated by all nations. For whose sake? For my name's sake." If we look back at the promises of Jesus in Matthew 5, verse 2, the Beatitudes, we find here something else about persecution. In verse 10, "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when they revile you and persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you." God's people are to expect persecution. If you stand up for Jesus, if you stand up for what you believe, you can expect persecution. It's not something to be feared, because who goes before you? God goes before us. So this tribulation, this idea of a tribulation, and Michael standing up, I want to share something with you. I'm going to erase this because we're going to go a different direction now. I want to share something with you. And this comes from the Seventh-day Adventist. Comes from the Seventh-day Adventist Bible Student Sourcebook. And it talks about the tribulation and God's wrath and the outpouring of God's wrath that we see in Revelation 16, the bowls of wrath that are poured out just before God says it is done. It says the great tribulation, so far as it involves the outpouring of God's wrath, will not engulf who? God's people. If that were not the case, the tribulation would be an experience of unimaginable horror. However, God has not destined us to wrath, but to what? Obtain salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ. This time of trouble that's spoken of in Daniel, not to get too far off into the weeds on that, but this discussed in Daniel chapter 12, verse 1, this time of trouble is a time of trouble for the saints. It's a trouble in the sense that we learn from the spirit of prophecy that this is a time of intense soul searching for God's people, where the presence of God has been drawn away from the earth, and we're left searching our souls, while at the same time, angry men who have begun to experience the wrath of God are coming after us, coming after God's people. It's a time when we're searching our souls, where we have to put 100% of our faith and trust in Jesus to provide for us. This is the period that we cannot provide for ourselves any longer. This is the period that we talk about where God's people will flee to the mountains for protection. They will search their souls. They will inspect every moment of their lives, looking for unconfessed sins. God's wrath is not directed at His church and at His people. It's directed at those who have rejected Jesus. So, now that we've been through this, let's examine and look at a more cohesive biblical perspective of the events that we've discussed. Daniel 9:27 represents Jesus' ministry, death, and the Jewish leaders' rejection of Jesus through the act of stoning Stephen. So we have here these events. Jesus' baptism. We understand the cross to be His crucifixion, correct? Okay. And the stoning of Stephen. The stoning of Stephen was the ultimate rejection by the Jewish leaders of Jesus as the Messiah. I would invite you to go to Acts, if you haven't done it before, and read what Stephen says as this moment is happening, because it's very powerful. And it makes very plain and very clear that this is the moment when the rejection of Jesus becomes its fullest. We've already discussed how the 70 weeks are a part of the 2,300 days, the larger 2,300 days. The 2,300 days ends when? 1844. And what event do we as Adventists understand occurred in 1844? Jesus went into the most holy place to begin what? The cleansing of the sanctuary. Okay? Now we understand, because of our understanding of the sanctuary service, that the cleansing of the sanctuary speaks about what day? The Day of Atonement. This is the eschatological Day of Atonement. Okay? Jesus is going into the most holy place to minister before God on our behalf. This is where He is mediating on our behalf before God. He is cleansing the temple, if you will. Next, we have a moment. Let me put my second and my coming back here. Next, we have this period where Michael stands up. And when Michael stands up, what happens? We have a time of what? We have a time of trouble. After Michael stands up, it's interesting. As I was thinking about this, I kind of had a moment. When a judge is fixing to make his final verdict, and he's fixing to say what he's going to say at the end of a trial, who stands up? The plaintiff. I'm sorry, the defendant. The defendant stands up. Who is Jesus? He's our defendant. So Michael stands up before God before his final pronouncement. Okay? We see in Revelation 16 that God says what? It is finished. And at it is finished, the seventh bowl of God's wrath is poured out. So we hear, it is done, is said by God. So, here's where this gets really interesting. Because if we go back to Matthew 24, people are always wanting to put a date on what? When is Jesus coming again? Everybody wants to know, when is Jesus coming again? Jesus was crystal clear on this subject. He was as crystal clear as He was with His disciples when He told them that He was here to be what? Crucified, a sacrifice. He was here to be the Lamb of God, not the Lord of Lords and King of Kings, right? He was as crystal clear with them in Matthew 24, verse 36, Matthew 24, verse 36, where He says, "But of that day and hour," speaking of judgment, speaking of the end of the age, "but of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, but who? My Father only." Adventists don't put dates. We do not put dates on this for a good reason. Because it dilutes the mind and it draws us away from what we should be focused on, which is what? Being a witness to the people of God. Our whole job, our whole purpose right now is to be ministering to people, to be reaching people. So as we start a new year, here's the encouragement that I would give you. Right now, we exist in between this period of time. We exist somewhere in that period of time. And with each year that passes, we grow closer to what? We grow closer to the time when Michael will stand up and when God will say it is finished. We are moving ever closer to that time with each year that passes. Take comfort in that and work on people's behalf with the power of God to show people who Jesus is by your example, by what He's done in your life, in my life, in our lives. This is what we need to be doing. This is the urgency that we have. Okay? When that happens is of no consequence. The point is, we're in between this little chunk of time. And we're moving ever closer to that final moment. So, what is the millennium? There's two important things that happen during the 1,000 years. First, Satan and his angels are bound to earth. Jeremiah 4:23 through 26 tells us, I beheld the earth, and indeed it was without form and void. And the heavens, they had no light. I beheld the mountains, and indeed they trembled, and all the hills moved back and forth. Does it sound like the earth is inhabitable at this point? No. I beheld, and indeed there was what? No man. And all the birds of the heavens had fled. I beheld, and indeed the fruitful land was what? Wilderness. And all its cities were broken down at the presence of the Lord by his fierce anger. This is the image that Jeremiah has after the second coming. This is what the earth is presented to him. It's presented as desolate. There's no one here. John the Revelator tells us that the earth has been left desolate, and that Satan has been bound here to deceive the nations no more. He no longer will be able to mingle in men's minds. He will no longer be able to influence people. That power has been taken away from him. The second important thing about the millennium is in 1 Corinthians 6, verses 2 and 3. Do you not know that the saints will judge the world? And if the world will be judged by you, are you unworthy to judge the smallest matters? Do you not know that we shall judge angels? How much more things that pertain to this life? When we look at Revelation chapter 20, and I'm almost finished. When we look at Revelation chapter 20, and we see this moment, we see in verse 4, and I saw thrones, and they sat on them, and judgment was committed to them. Then I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for their witness to Jesus and for the word of God, who had not worshipped the beast or his image, and had not received his mark on their foreheads or on their hands. And they lived and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. But the rest of the dead did not live again until the 1,000 years were finished. This is the first resurrection. The first resurrection is the resurrection of the righteous in Christ. Blessed, John goes on to say in verse 6, blessed and holy is he who has part in the first resurrection. Over such the second death has no power, but they shall be priests of God and of Christ, and shall reign with him 1,000 years. Friends, the 1,000-year period will be a very somber period. It will be a time when all will be revealed to God's people. The books will be opened, and all will be made plain. There will be no question left in God's people's minds as to the long suffering of Christ, as to the desire for God to call his people back to him. There will be no question. All will be revealed. We will have full and complete understanding. As painful as it may be, we will have full and complete understanding of why people are not there. That 1,000-year period is an opportunity for healing. It's an opportunity to understand the purposes of God and the way that he's worked in people's lives. It's our duty now, as we go into this new year, to be witnesses for Christ to a fallen world, so that as near as possible, as few will be judged by the saints. Won't you bow your heads with me? Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for your sacrifice. Lord, as we go into this new year with all its promises and with all its hopes and with all its dreams, Lord, it's my prayer that we won't focus so much on this world, but that we'll focus on you. That we'll count what is eternal as most important. That we'll go forth boldly and speak boldly to those that you would have us share your message of hope with. Lord, please come soon and save us all. In your name we pray. Amen.